Hi everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Ian Proud, a former British diplomat, to discuss his article, Britain Remains Cursed by Bipolar Diplomacy, which I will definitely leave a link in the description. So welcome back to the program.
Good to see you again, Glenn.
You too. So yeah, your article, you write that foreign policy liberals have become merely impotent extremists, and you start to discuss from the 90s with the desire to have an ethical British foreign policy. I was wondering if you can flesh out your arguments, why Britain remains cursed by this bipolar diplomacy.
Well, thanks, Glenn. To start with the foundations to that, I mean, there's been a move over the past 25, I suppose, to 30 years to kind of frame Western foreign policy in moral terms, that we're seeking to achieve some sort of greater good through foreign policy interventions. Now, bring it forward to the present day, and some people may argue that's just a new form of neocolonialism. But setting that aside, in terms of the practicalities of diplomacy, certainly in the UK, there's a drive to kind of create this ethical foreign policy, which came in when Robin Cook became our Foreign Secretary in 1997 under the Tony Blair sort of era. And, we try to do things sort of ethically. But in reality, foreign policy for any nation is always rooted in national interest, whether people like to admit that or not. And actually, the Ukraine war is a really classic example of that. Nationalism has provided guardrails on the more extremes of morality kind of led foreign policy that may have taken us into a war with Russia that would have been in nobody's good interest. So, whether we like it or not, nationalism holds us back, from moral foreign policy, because decision makers, the British Prime Minister, the French, the German, and so on, ultimately have to think about the needs of their domestic political constituency, first and foremost, and that constrains our actions, and that's just an inevitable given, I think, of foreign policy. That creates this kind of bipolar diplomacy, if you like, where people are talking about morality. Again, the Ukraine war is a classic example of that. The war on terror, is another one. Of course, the long and failed intervention in Afghanistan and that sort of thing. Arab Spring, there's a long, list of conflicts that we've engaged, through a moral lens, but ultimately have fallen foul of actually the domestic constraints under which we operate. And that is the bipolar diplomacy that we can live in, where decision makers are unable to kind of let go of this attachment to morality. And that's why I call liberal sort of foreign policy people the new extremists, because they cloak themselves in this kind of moral, highbrow kind of, we're so worthy lexicon and mantle and all the rest of it. But in fact, it's the people who want to put the interests of the country first who are actually the more moderate, the people that are called the nationalists. Nationalist has become a new pejorative. Nationalist implies extremism. Liberalism implies moderation. Well, of course, I'm suggesting that way of describing and framing it should be flipped.
Yes, well, for political realists, well, in the literature, there's always been this skepticism of the liberals or idealists, because the flip side of seeing the opportunity to transform the world is, if you see the world as it is today, which is deeply flawed, and you think it can be replaced by this ethical, moral, utopia, uh, essentially transcending the great power rivalry and yeah, this end of history, as Fukuyama put it, then if you can cross from the one to the other, you would be prepared to do almost anything. And that is, the old idea that the premise of perpetual peace puts us on a path of perpetual war, because with those great noble ends, it legitimizes almost anything, I guess. Um, but do you see any of these concerns now being raised in Britain? Because in the 1960s, you had people like Raymond Aron, who warned that the idealist would worsen the crimes of the realist by essentially ignoring to see the world as it is. But is there any shifts in the United States? In the United Kingdom, because well, this has been going on since the 1990s, but as it fails, you would assume there would be a pushback at some point.
Yeah, well, there has been a pretty big shift in the US through the election of Donald Trump, who is avowedly nationalist in his orientation. The whole "Make America Great Again," slogan is all about putting the US first, which is a fundamentally nationalist, starting point. Now, I don't agree with all of Trump's positions, but you would have to agree that he is essentially a nationalist in his orientation and not an idealist. He sees the world as it is and tries to kind of make deals on the basis of that. Now, if you bring it back to the UK, but also Europe, more broadly, I think the start of the 21st century was very much characterized by this kind of rush to the middle ground politically. And you see elements of that still today, but everybody tried to kind of conquer the middle ground of moderation in domestic policy. So people became branded centre-right, or they were kind of centre-left. If you're hard right or hard left, that was a bad thing. Everybody had to be kind of somewhere somewhere in the middle. Morality, ethics, that's kind of, if you like, fed what we see as a kind of less palatable, outcomes, such as the woke, movement. So very much dominated a domestic political discourse. But actually, more recently, fast forward to today, we've been through the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, a massive, pandemic, several failed military interventions. That, if you like, has kind of spurned a disenfranchisement of people who feel excluded from that political conversation. You see that in the UK with the growth of the Reform Party, for example, before then the UK Independence Party. In France, actually, that's been going on for much longer with Marine Le Pen's party, and obviously led by her father before her. And now in Germany with the AfD, and you see it in Central Europe, possibly for different sort of underlying political reasons, through Fidesz and machinations have been happening in Romania and everything else. So, I mean, nationalism has been on the rise. But my question is that necessarily a bad thing? If that's the type of nationalism that leads countries, yes, to put their core national interests first, but to seek to live in peaceful coexistence with other nationalist states, rather than to kind of pursue under the banner of idealism or morality and so on, perpetual wars, as we've seen most recently, of course, in Ukraine.
Yeah, the French I think they have an interesting expression. They call it the radical center, because if you look at the far left or far right, they're the one who's advocating now for diplomacy, no more war. But in the center, you have this conformity where they seem
Yes.
to be getting less and less rational.
Yeah. Well, that's my point about the liberals being the new extremists. I mean, that's essentially the same point, right? Because the so-called moderates in the middle are the ones who want the war to continue. And actually the people, including in Reform, I mean, Nigel Farage got slightly bitten when he sort of spoke out about the sort of, the war in Ukraine, and was quickly hammered by all of the kind of mainstream media outlets. I mean, that is my point, that kind of the radical center, the liberal extremists, that is exactly the same point that I'm making. Not that I'd align myself with Marine Le Pen's party in any other way, of course.
But on the topic of nationalism, because you do advocate for a moderate nationalism, I think the reason why nationalism has, well, it's powerful force and appeals to human nature, I think, because we always organize in groups. It's the in-group us versus the out-group the other.
Yeah.
And nationalism usually takes on a very ugly face when you start to organize the nations in a hierarchy. So this is the Übermensch, or who is higher than the others. But in the 1990s, you had people like Robert Cooper, who under this new liberal internationalism, he, by the way, he was an advisor to Blair, if I'm not mistaken. But he he wrote books and articles advocating for
I met him.
new liberal imperialism. Well, yeah, you're in the among the top diplomats in Britain, so that makes sense that you hang around. But I can understand where that there's a genuine some altruism behind this, that many come into this with good intentions. But his whole idea was we need liberal imperialism because it allowed the more civilized ideas to defeat the more barbaric ideas. So, But this then it kind of becomes, you introduce some nationalism inherently if you start to rank the powers based on their civilizational development. And as he wrote,
Yeah.
we are the garden, Cooper said, they are the jungle. It's our task to, civilize them, and we can't necessarily play by the same rules as we do in the garden when we engage with the jungle, which just sounds a bit like, I've now forgot his name, the EU, Joseph Borrell, yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah.
But again, as I said that right at the start, that is a new form of neo-colonialism. Really this attempt to kind of convert, the kind of lesser beings of Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union to our kind of worthy ways, and it's been a spectacular failure, and will continue to be so. And countries not just Russia's kind of pushing back against this. Obviously, they've taken a stand, but you look at other battlegrounds like Georgia, for example, that we were lucky enough to visit together in June of this year. They're saying, well, we just want to live according to our values as proud Georgian sort of people, being in good company with the Europeans and being in good company with the Russians. And what's wrong with that? They don't want to be overtaken by this kind of new colonial sort of European empire, rather than just to live their own lives and to get along with everybody. And that's the core kind of challenge of multipolarity right now, right? That people don't want to have to choose between this side or that side. That's another aspect of bipolar diplomacy. Diplomacy shouldn't really be about encouraging one state to pick sides with one power against another power. If all that means is that state is caught in the middle of a great power struggle, as has happened in Ukraine and elsewhere, to its detriment. I mean, countries want to live in a multipolar world where they can enjoy good relations with all of the powers to the greatest extent possible.
Well, sometimes I think of Socrates, because he made this argument that, I'm a citizen of the world, which becomes with the anti-nationalist in the current era, because you suggest that, us versus them, the borders, this shouldn't matter at all. And it comes from a good place of altruism. But then one of the students of Socrates, Alexander the Great, he also used a citizen of the world by suggesting, then disputing the idea that we are any different than them. So this becomes also a chant for empire when you expand. So I guess my point is, it can have benign intentions while still play out in a very imperialistic manner, with which I guess.
I think that's absolutely right. And actually, Theresa May said, I think I mentioned it in my article, that if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Of course, with that, I agree, because I fundamentally can associate myself with the idea that we're all, part of one kind of global community. We should all kind of seek to foster, good relations with each other. Every diplomat should have that curiosity to understand better, the country in which he or she operates, to learn the language, to meet the people, and all those good things. But when it comes back to it, nationalism ultimately governs kind of both domestic policy and foreign policy of the countries concerned, and that's just a fact of life that you have to live with, while aspiring to this, greater ideal of community. And the irony, of course, is that the liberals have somehow kind of subjugated that kind of notion that actually nationalism is fundamentally a bad thing, and that there should be only one greater aim that drives all of our actions, irrespective of domestic choice.
So the 90s ethical ideas of society and international affairs, you see this as leading to both this moral crusades, as well as diluting the internal cohesion of the nation states themselves?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the war on terror after 9/11. I actually flew back from the US on the night of 9/10 and landed in Heathrow in time to go into the Foreign Office and start work, with lots of coffee to deal with the jet lag, and watch the events unfolding on the TV, in New York. And I was involved in looking at the initial intelligence dossier after that had happened. It showed a link to Afghanistan. It showed absolutely no link at all to Iraq. That was then sexed up, but that's much bigger kind of cautionary tale, but actually that then led to this kind of war on terror, this axis of evil, the idea that there are the evil people out there and the good people, i.e. we were the good people, and the Americans, were the good people, and we should sort of, rain down hellfire on all the bad people, which was, obviously Iraq, and that had wider spillover effects for the whole of the Middle East, for over a decade after that point in time, and of course Afghanistan until 2021. So I mean, there's that very much right from the start of the 21st century that this moral outrage about, frankly, a terrible and unconscionable terrorist attack, of course, in New York and Washington, drove this kind of morality-driven crusade that caused millions of people to either lose their life or be displaced from their homes across the Middle East, with ramifications that we still see today. And it's something that President Putin has spoken about a lot, that, how NATO has done a great job in messing up the world and he wasn't going to let it happen in his backyard. And it seems that, that's what he's been determined to do.
Yeah, the terrorism thing, that's interesting way of advancing this, ethical policy, because when you deal with terrorists, you shouldn't, I guess, empathize with their objectives or their means.
Yeah,
Well, you
yeah, of
shouldn't.
course.
I would advocate one wouldn't. But of course, if from the realist perspective, it's more comfortable to, if you look at the states with competing security interests, you always have the assumption you have to recognize each other's security concerns to avoid or mitigate the security competition. But when you see the world through this moral lens, where, well, to borrow Bush, this is good guys versus bad guys, which seems to be, stuck in our thinking these days as well, in the collective consciousness, then you end up not being able to consider their security concern, and every struggle is just to defeat the bad guys. What does this do to diplomacy? Or how do you see, for example, the conflict now, the proxy war we're fighting against the Russians, being influenced by this mentality?
Well, it has been from the start of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. In fact, before that, in the run-up to the Vilnius Eastern Partnership Summit, where Yanukovych famously didn't sign the association agreement. From that point on, Russia was kind of framed as the bad guy, the villain of the peace, that wanted to kind of subjugate Ukraine under this kind of post-Soviet model, and Russia has been framed as a bad guy ever since, and that has driven all of our actions on Russia and Ukraine policy since the end of 2013 through to the present day. And this idea that Russia is bad and we're the good guys has been absolutely core to what we've seen happening in the Ukraine war. We can't get beyond our outrage and our sense that the Russians are the bad guys to see that, in fact, actually Russia probably wants exactly the same things that we want, to live in peace and mutual harmony, with each other. But yet we've been determined to try and conquer Russia because of the huge size of us as a military kind of grouping, 31, now 32 states, 1 billion sort of population, 55% of global defense spending. Surely the bad guys would have to back down in the end. And of course, the bad guys haven't. And now people are starting to say, well, maybe we're the bad guys. And that's interesting conversation going on now, and will start to unfold, frankly, after peace, hopefully, is settled in Ukraine. European citizens are going to start to ask whether actually their leaders are the bad guys. And I think that is the big and messy debate to come.
Yeah. No, this seems to be the diplomatic goals of the Europeans now, though, because as we speak, the European leaders are heading over to Washington to try to, stop Trump from from pursuing this peace deal with the Russians. And but the whole goal appears to be as to get the Americans back into the fight. That is, for Trump to become Biden 2.0. And so there's no plan in this sense. But as you said, it might be the general idea in the back of the head that, together we are so strong, we have all this military power. If we just continue doing the same, we have to be able to defeat the Russians. What that defeat means, how that actually translates to a peace without blowing up the world, like all of these things aren't really addressed, though, or technical stuff like like manpower or military equipment. All this isn't really assessed, but But how do you say? Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, and of course, national choices held back our actions, because if we wanted to, we could have gone to war with Russia in 2014. We could have gone to war with Russia in 2022, but we didn't, because we were constrained by national choices. That to do that would threaten our own national interests, given the risk of thermonuclear war. So that kind of that necessarily kind of constrained our actions, but didn't stop us, nevertheless, from pursuing a bad strategy, nonetheless.
In your article, though, you mentioned the feminist foreign policy agenda of Annalena Baerbock, Germany's former foreign minister. What is a feminist foreign policy, and how do you see it playing out to explain some of Germany's direction? Because as of course a British diplomat, you're putting the light on Britain, being critical, but this is not unique to Britain. In fact, one can argue that Germany's been hit much harder by this madness.
Yeah. Well, I like to see myself as a feminist. I have a young daughter who wants to grow up into a strong and independent sort of woman and have access to jobs with the same opportunities as men. And in that regard, I very much see myself as a feminist. But I think the term feminist foreign policy is, in practical terms, absolutely meaningless. It doesn't really mean anything. I mean, foreign policy should be driven by core security, so core national interests. And there are three key ones that I talk about quite a lot. One is to maintain the territorial integrity of the state. One is to protect your citizens from harm wherever they are in the world. And the third is to provide for the prosperity of all of your citizens and reduce poverty and create access to that and that sort of thing. Feminine, that's in terms of how we project our relationships with other countries. Feminism doesn't really play a role, in that. Maybe it's fine in terms of how the Germans manage their foreign ministry and their diplomatic service. That's entirely fine. But as a kind of slogan of foreign policy, in my view, it is frankly meaningless. It doesn't really help the Germans make sense of how they engage with Saudi Arabia, for example, or kind of Syria. It doesn't really help them to make sense of how best to maximize their relationships with countries where the kind of whole religious and cultural settlement is vastly different from their own.
But if you start a time frame from the 90s to see how foreign policies and as well as how it plays out domestically in terms of nationalism being scorned, and you take it up to today, do you see America first then to be like the main counter reaction, or is this why the Europeans are so hostile to the idea of America first?
Yeah, I mean, I think the American position has largely mirrored the European position up until Trump's election at the end of last year and his appointment at the start of this year. And arguably that's kind of driven sort of European diplomacy to kind of move and follow that, that ethical direction, too. There's a bit of a punctuation mark there with Trump's first term, but he was so completely out maneuvered within DC that he was unable really to impose a nationalist imprint on foreign policy in a way that he's been able to, since his appointment this year. So I think actually the Americans and the Europeans and the British kind of dimension on an ethical foreign policy is largely kind of aligned, frankly, since the start of the war on terror, and is only now coming to a juddering halt under Trump too, and with the consequences that we see happening before our eyes right at the moment, with, as you say, the Europeans hightailing it out to the White House to try and persuade Trump that he's wrong and that we just need to have strength through power, or whatever it is, power through strength. I don't know. I keep losing sight of these kind of Ukrainian and European slogans, that we just need to have more sanctions on Russia, that we just need to kind of keep letting Zelensky fight. You can almost predict what the conversation is going to be like in the White House today. This massive kind of schism has opened up between the Europeans and the US, and I think that actually that can only be a helpful thing, because this has been a conversation that we frankly needed to have at least kind of 14, 15 years.
Yeah, I see in the media today as well, a lot of focus is on how much equipment the Russians have lost. They're not really as strong as you want them to be. And a lot of these losses on the Russian side are very much inflated. But again, it seems to serve the purpose of, narrative control, that, the Russians are hurting. All we have to do, bring a little bit more pain. And then,
Yeah.
we don't have to make this peace deal, because the whole premise that we have to make a peace deal is based on the recognition that, we're losing. And, well, again, if you get a worse deal tomorrow than today, you make a deal today, no matter how bad it would be, if
Yeah.
it's the best you can get. But you see the Europeans eventually coming around to their own, because the whole idea is, if you don't pursue national interests, you're gonna eventually exhaust yourself. Because we do have security issues in Europe now. We have a problem of political legitimacy. I mean,
Yeah.
the leaders, nobody likes them anymore in Europe. Starmer, Macron, Merz. This
And
is,
he's only just been elected.
yeah. So how, at some point, do these have to be washed away? Like, you do think they will be washed away, but then they're replaced by someone almost identical. So how long can this go on? Or do you think the system will correct itself somehow?
I think we're going through a massive system correction right now. And actually, in fairness, we probably have been since Trump's dressing down of Zelensky in the Oval Office. Back in February, the British and the French came up with this coalition of the willing idea. It's been clear throughout the whole time that the British and the French in particular have been really determined to kind of persuade Trump to think otherwise, and that has failed. And Trump's position today is no different than it was, when he came to power. There's talks about, not getting Crimea back, Ukraine not joining NATO. There's absolutely no sign at all that Trump is going to change his fundamental position on the root cause of the war. And people complain that he's pro-Putin, all the rest of it, but there's no sign that he's going to kind of change that. And actually, the Europeans are starting to kind of face a reckoning that actually they will have to pay for a war that they can't afford if they don't come on board. And I think what the Americans are doing to try and broker some sort of compromise around security assurances to allow for taking NATO off the table is fundamentally a helpful thing. I think the Americans are working incredibly hard to kind of land a deal here, and then they're trying to kind of meet the European and Ukrainian needs around security assurances, and that sort of thing. My sense is that the Europeans will cut their losses over the next kind of 2 or 3 months. And right now they're going through a period of thinking about how they spin defeat as victory. I mean, that's what I see is happening right now. They're thinking about how can we spin this as a victory when it's actually defeat, in a way that sort of limits domestic political consequences for us. I mean, that's a big system correct that's going on right now, and the risk mitigation that the European politicos are sort of working through furiously.
Well, as they're coming to terms with reality, though, the Ukrainians are just losing a ton of men. They're losing territory every day. Their infrastructure being destroyed. Their ability to ever recover is weakening day by day.
I
It just seems cruel. And this is kind of the irony, I think, because all of this is being done in the name of morality and virtue. But, those virtuous slogans, which was used when we toppled the government, when when supported sending these militias down to Donbass, when ignoring the Minsk agreement, sabotaging Istanbul, rejecting diplomacy, like all these things which have just brought horror to the country.
Yeah.
Is all of it has been done with this liberal idealist slogans. It's just
Well, yeah. And it's been done to protect their domestic positions, because to limit the domestic political risks to them. You're absolutely right. This war should have ended within a month of it starting, with the Istanbul the Istanbul agreements. It didn't, because we're determined to secure this victory, for as long as it takes against the bad guy, which is, everybody sees as Putin in the liberal West, and actually that has failed. But I mean, people have been unwilling to fail for very domestic political reasons, because they're not sure really how they can sell that failure to their domestic constituencies, and that's the best way I have to kind of make sense of this utter waste of human life and property and everything else that's happened over the past 3.5 years.
One of my favorite British diplomats, though, Alistair Crook, we were speaking on, and he was making the point that he thinks that Europe probably has to be able to absorb a lot of pain or like something like losing the Ukraine war before it really is able to begin to change course, because it looks as if the narrative control, the consensus around policies which are now sort of deemed moral and like liberal, which means we don't accept dissent, that is to be so hardened that you need a real almost crisis in order to break out of this very hard spot.
I think that's right. There's been absolutely incredible narrative control, hasn't there, since the start of the war, and actually right back to the start of the Ukraine crisis. Russia's the bad guys and we're the good guys, and all the rest of it. I mean, I think what has happened actually, which is probably going to make it easier for the European politicos to kind of shift, is this record. You need any hero in any sort of story, any sort of fairy tale, and for the West, that's been Zelensky right from the very beginning. And actually, it's only recently that there's been, even though Western governments will have known about this, in fact, from the very beginning, there's been a massive wake-up call with the whole anti-corruption law issue in Ukraine, for the first time since the war started. Mainstream British newspapers are staunchly kind of pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian, like the Daily Telegraph, for example, the Financial Times, the Economist, are all producing articles that are extremely critical of Zelensky. Owen Matthews writing that actually Zelensky's now the problem, not the solution to ending the war, and that sort of thing. There's been a massive cold shower on that narrative control, and I think that is, ironically going to make it easier for the European politicos to kind of try and cut the losses and spin the way out of this. But until they do that, as you say, more people will die, and that's the great tragedy of this terrible war.
In the 1950s, I think British academic Gleason, he was writing about Russophobia and as a study, because it was hard to make sense from a British perspective, because Britain and Russia doesn't have that many competing national interests. So how can they always explain how the two countries are, or that there's so extreme hostility towards Russia, which leads to policies which undermines British interest? And when you say the roles which are taken on, I was thinking when you mentioned that, because he looked towards the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, and everyone had to take on a role. So when the Russians came in conflict with the Ottomans had to play the role of the innocent, damsel in distress, or however you want to frame it. But traditionally they have been seen as like very brutal aggressor against the Greek. But suddenly overnight they were given the role of this innocent heroic victim. And it's a little bit like Ukraine. They also they were corrupt, all these problems, and then overnight Zelensky became this Churchill 2.0. So Ukraine played the role of the innocent victim. The Russians became the aggressor, and the British would then play the role of this knight in shining armor who would come and help the poor victim.
Yeah.
And you see this almost in all conflicts. You always, these three roles have to be assigned, but it does have to be cracking.
That helps with narrative control, right? Because if you can maintain the integrity of those kind of roles, the victim, the aggressor, the savior, then actually it makes it easier to kind of have that narrative control, that utter consistency across the British and I think Western, actually, mainstream media, that, and actually they use it. I mean, Russia's the aggressor, you hear all the time. Ukraine is a victim, and we're only really interested in helping Ukraine, coming to their aid. So I mean, but the point I'm making, I think, is that has been broken. And I think actually it's been broken by virtue of the partly by the anti-corruption law scandal that Zelensky kind of shot himself in the foot over, I fear, but also actually with Trump meeting Putin in Alaska. Because a core plank of maintaining that the bad guys, Putin's the aggressor role in this tragedy, Shakespearean tragedy that we've been sort of watching, is not talking to Putin. isolating Putin. If you talk to Putin, that's a victory for the bad guy, so therefore don't talk to Putin. Well, that's another leg that's been broken by Trump laying out the red carpet for Putin and getting on well, giving him a ride in the beast, in stark contrast to his meeting with Zelensky in February. So that pillar has been damaged as well by Trump saying, well, actually, he's just a regular guy and he's a head of state. And as a head of state, if you want to resolve conflicts, we have to talk to each other. So that's been dented too. And actually the third, the kind of the savior narrative, I can write an article on this after talking to you, Glenn. This is a really good sort of line for an article for me to write about the savior. Well, that's not really working either, because we haven't come to Ukraine's rescue. We never sent troops, to help them. We don't have any money to support them, sort of, long term, and there's no credible military capabilities that we're prepared to put into the theatre in any case, because our armies are too small. So the whole thing is starting. The whole kind of storyline of this is starting to break down.
And when the intelligence chief of Germany came out and said, we need to keep this war going at least 5 more years to prepare ourselves for a future conflict with Russia, then you had the pro-Western presidential candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko, came out and said, our worst fears have now been confirmed, that, we're being used by the Europeans as cannon fodder. And so this kind of put also a bit of a dent lately, you see, in the whole idea that we are in this for some altruistic goal. We just really, really care about the Ukrainians. This is, why we're fighting to the last Ukrainian. So this has kind of been dented. And I guess also, once Trump started to talk about NATO, no NATO, then this is also implicitly recognizing that, it wasn't necessarily unprovoked. Doesn't mean it's legitimate or within international law, but at least it wasn't unprovoked. Then it also harms the bad guy image. And as you said, the Ukraine as this innocent actor with Zelensky as the Churchillian hero, it is all kind of falling apart very quickly. My last question, though, was just about how do you, what expectations do you have now? Because, well, this is, Monday the 18th, and as we speak, the Europeans are heading over to Washington. Trump just had a meeting with Putin, and he will now have a meeting with Zelensky. Zelensky brings backup, which is essentially all the European leaders who, well, they're the top European leaders, but no one actually has anything that can resemble a decent approval rating. But nonetheless, they're all coming over to provide a backup. How do you see this playing out in this wider context of a bipolar diplomacy?
And nobody's really explained why Alexander Stubbs going. But anyway, that's another matter. It's going to go one or two ways. The Europeans are either going to sort of say, well, look, we need to get on board with this, and legitimate security guarantees for Ukraine in a post-war settlement is as good as you're going to get, from the Americans, enshrined in laws, according to Prof, and Zelensky will just have to get on board with that, or they're not going to get on board with that, and they're going to say, well, damn you, Trump, we're going to carry on anyway. Radek Sikorsky is saying, well, we can just keep giving the Ukrainians the money to fight, even if the Americans can pull out. So it's going to go one or two ways. I hope it's going to go. I hope it's going to go in the way of the former, that people recognize that they just need to cut their losses, accept the U.S. security guarantees for a kind of post-war settlement. I think the trickiest issue is going to be on this territory issue with withdrawing Ukrainian troops from bits of Donbass that they still occupy. That is probably going to be the biggest stumbling block, quite frankly, at this late stage. But I hope they come up with some miraculous deal. I just don't see why Zelensky will see in his interest to do that, because that's for him political suicide. So again, back to the kind of purely domestic. Zelensky will know that any agreement he cuts now will look like a failure, and that will lead to the end of his political career. So my fear is that Zelensky will just hold out, and that the Europeans will be too weak to tell him, actually, look, Vladimir, we just need to kind of cut our losses now, and we'll just carry on into 2026. But I'm hoping for the former.
Yeah, me too. Anyways, thank you so much for letting me pick your brain, and And I can't recommend enough your articles. It's definitely all excellent and great reading. So I will, as I said, put a link in the description for those who are interested in following. So thanks again.
Cheers, Glenn. Great to talk to you again. Bye for now.